Hello.
What do you want?
I'd like to place an order. Who would have thought Blinky Lights as a service would have been so popular? All right, here we go. Today is Monday, November 3rd, 2014, and this is episode 91 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as usual, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry, and I think we can call this the Hobbled and Broken Podcast.
That's right, and you'll probably notice that there isn't any fun stuff at the front or the back of this podcast. I apologize. I've been winged. So.
He's podcasting one-handed, folks, and you can interpret that any way you like.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm apparently losing my voice, so if I sound weird tonight, I'm sorry.
Weirder than normal.
Yeah, weirder than normal. However, I was thinking about this today. I'm really humbled and honored by the amount of people who choose to spend an hour with us each week. And Absolutely. I really did want to just say thank you. I mean, I had no idea that this would grow to be as popular as it is, and I had no idea that people cared to listen to us, and this was just something fun to do, and apparently people find us interesting enough to listen. So that's pretty cool, and so thanks.
Yep, absolutely. I'll echo that. Thank you very much. It's been quite a wild ride, and there are quite a few of you listening these days. So my server seems to be keeping up, though. Anyhow, getting into our stories for this evening, our first one comes from Yahoo News. That might be the first time we've ever used Yahoo News, I think. But the title is J.P. Morgan found hackers through breach of corporate event website. And I think we covered this breach a couple of episodes ago, and at the time there weren't a whole lot of details, and there was some consternation about how many people were involved. But here's some interesting new details about the breach, and I always like to follow up with that stuff when we can find it. As it turns out, apparently the way this came to light is that J.P. Morgan sponsors this corporate challenge, which I guess is some kind of a race. I'm not entirely clear about that. And apparently some of the IDs that belong to this corporate challenge website were amongst the multiple billions of user IDs and passwords that Hold Security found. And you will remember that story from a number of months ago, and we talked at length about that. Apparently, Hold Security figured out or somehow tied some of those back to J.P. Morgan's event site. And in the ensuing investigation J.P. Morgan performed, they found that some what I would assume are command and control systems. And when they started looking around in their own network, sure enough, they see traffic from their own servers to those same command and control hosts. And there aren't a lot of other details beyond that, except to say this is something that I would like to read verbatim. Quote, the hackers had originally gained access to the bank's network by compromising the computer of an employee with special privileges, had used both at work and at home, and then moved across the bank's network to access contact data, the Wall Street Journal said. Yeah, so that kind of that kind of says it right there. Similar story to many other breaches like that. To me, there's an interesting lesson here. Well, I guess there's two lessons. Number one is, again, if you got special privileges, maybe you shouldn't be doing risky stuff. Just saying. And the other is what they, the way they found out about this was by looking in their own corporate or their banking network, was by looking for indicators that had been found in the compromise of their corporate challenge site. And to me, one of the interesting implications is, that traffic was there to find all along. They just didn't know to look for it. So as soon as they started looking for presumably certain IP addresses, sure enough that it showed up. So we don't know, what kind of command and control channel it was, whether it was it IRC or was it, Gmail draft documents or something else. We don't really have that kind of information, but it does point out that a lot of the stuff is there for the finding.
Yeah, I would agree. And I once again, here's another major breach that was found by a third party. So we are clearly failing to do breach detection in our major enterprises to do well. And you're right. These things are we don't know exactly what happened on that original compromise. I would bet it might have been a phishing attack, but it's really tough to know based on the information we have. But once again, yeah, we are just not catching this stuff until some third party is pointing it out to us, and that's not good.
No, at the same time, though, I had read the book The Signal and the Noise and I know we've talked about this a couple times in the past, by Nate Silver. And one of the points he brings up is that in retrospect, the signal always looks really clear. And, whereas before you are aware that something's bad is going on, it's just a bunch of unrelated noise. But once the bad thing happens and you go back and look in retrospect, it all becomes clear. But,
I think that's fair. I guess the point I would make is clearly prevention is failing.
Yes.
So are we shifting as an industry to focus more on breach detection and breach containment? Now, I'm not saying that's trivial. I'm not saying that's easy. But it seems like that's where we should be spending more of our time and money and energy.
Agreed. Yeah, I definitely think in general we have that mix wrong. So anyhow, moving on to our next story. This one comes from SC Magazine. The title is Deloitte Releases Paper on Vetting Leaks, Avoiding Costly Hoax. And I wanted to throw this one in here because I see this happen quite a lot where some hacktivist group, usually it's a hacktivist group, will release something on Pastebin, and usually it's lately the MO has been they'll release a couple of thousand what looks like usernames and passwords from a database, and then they'll offer to release the rest of it for a Bitcoin or two. And honestly, I suspect, I guess I've grown really cynical in my old age, and I have to wonder how many times that data is actually from whence it is claimed to be. And I think that the problem is exactly what this paper is intending to solve or help solve, right? It doesn't give you a foolproof solution, but how do you quickly determine if something that's purported to be a data leak from your website is in fact a legitimate leak from your website? And so this paper goes through some kind of in a flowchart format, some things you can do pretty quickly. And I also noticed you can, for the most part, actually do it on a third-party site too. There didn't seem to be, on most of their checks, in quotes, a need to have specific access to the underlying application. You could do this as an outsider. So I thought that was pretty worthwhile to read, especially for those of us who work in an industry where this could possibly be something we would have to deal with.
Yeah, I think the author makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I think the vast majority of the industry will ignore it.
Yep.
Some of it is common sense, some of it is, a really good way to vet if this is new, if this is real. I think it's worth putting out there. I think the vast majority of the media will absolutely disregard it.
I think you're right. And by the way,
which gives me a sad. By the way, I'm not happy about that. I just.
I will say none of what's presented here is, like total aha, never thought of that kind of thing before, but it's a consolidation of sensible things that you might do to verify whether something is in fact from a particular site or not. So, but yeah, I think one of the obvious audiences to this is the media, right? This was not only for companies to go and, as you mentioned, verify their own breaches, but also for the media. So before the media runs off and reports that Brian Krebs's website got hacked and his database was on Pastebin, maybe they could have followed, what's in this document and not look so dumb.
But then who would we make fun of? And feel all smug and superior?
That's a good question. I don't know. We'll work on that.
Okay.
So, moving on, our next story comes from Dark Reading. And I usually don't talk about things like Drupal because it's, it's like picking on a kid, it's just not fair. So the story here, title is Drupal Attacks Start Within Hours of Patch Release. To me, the more interesting point here is the story that Drupal had this really horrible 0-day vulnerability released. It was an SQL injection. It essentially could allow an attacker to do whatever they wanted with your website. And apparently, shortly after disclosure of the vulnerability, there was some activity, and I would assume a lot of it was automated, or most of it was automated, to leverage that vulnerability and compromise these sites. And so subsequently, the people at Drupal have come out and said, basically, if you didn't patch within a couple of hours after the vulnerability disclosure, you're probably owned. And there's some in the industry. There's some debate about exactly how many Drupal sites there are, but it's somewhere between 1 and 7 million, as I understand it. So that's potentially, who knows how many of those were not patched in time. I'm going to guess quite a few. But that doesn't sound very good. To me, again, the bigger problem here is whether it's, let's say, Heartbleed, maybe not so much Heartbleed, but certainly Shell Shock. One of the things we have to think about when some significant vulnerability comes out that's trivial to exploit, we have to make a decision. If we patch and move on, we're kind of implicitly saying we don't think the server got compromised. And, that maybe that's right and maybe that's wrong. But I think we have to be aware that we are, in fact, making a decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to further extend that point, we're also making the assumption that there's no 0 days out there.
No, that's a good point, right? Which we know there are, right? I mean,
right. But when we see a widespread attack against a known exploit, and there is a patch, that patch window exists, I think you make a really good point. How do you know? How do you verify? How do you trust? And do you have anything in place that monitors for that sort of breach detection down the line, which could be months later, potentially?
Yeah, I think that to me the question becomes, what makes you comfortable that your site or your server or system application isn't compromised? Is it because you have some other instrumentation that you feel very confident would detect some anomalous activity, or is it that you have some other, system level controls that you feel very confident would either prevent or detect that, some kind of local intruder activity, or if you don't have any of that and you're just hoping and praying, that maybe it's time to take a step back and think about that.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about, and I think you make a lot of good points here. The other thing I was thinking about when I was reading this and taking some notes is, in a situation like this, we definitely have a problem, especially, I would say, well, I almost said it's worse with open source because you could actually look at the patch source code and see exactly what's being patched. But it's pretty trivial to reverse engineer and decompile a compiled patch for closed source and figure out what's being patched. And the bad guys are very good at looking at that and figuring out what to attack and going and figuring out that attack pretty quickly. So we've talked about this before. You've got this window of time, depending on how widespread these attacks are, how automated, are they building bots, that sort of thing. But we also default to the concept that our only possible reaction is a patch. And that's not necessarily true. There's other things we can do, potentially, depending on what it is that we're trying to mitigate against. Depending on, if it's web front end, if it's, it's all about reducing the attack. Let me back that up over. It's all about the basics again, right? Reducing the attack surface, having layered defenses, understanding these attacks, how they're conducted, what layers of defense you have in place that might have the ability to mitigate that attack, and deploying the appropriate mitigation for the situation. And what I see over and over again is organizations, that thought process, frankly, takes a lot of multidiscipline knowledge and not being stuck in a queue of ticket after ticket after ticket being generated by your SIEM that needs to be going worked. So it really, to me, points out that when these things are happening, we have these default reactions, but a very wise organization would have a very sharp individual who doesn't necessarily get down in the weeds in instant response, but can actually think out of the box a little bit without a ton of stress and pressure on them to come up with alternatives to mitigating.
Mm-hmm.
Long way of saying that.
Exploratory information security.
Well, it's just, I just see so many security guys and the security ops groups, and they're just running so hard. I don't know that they have the time to really say, all right, let's stop and think about this for a minute, right?
Yep, you're right.
And, you can go back to Apollo 13 as an excellent example of, in the movie, they've got that scene where they put a bunch of smart guys in a room and say, this is the problem. These are the tools we have. Give me some options. And if you can break people away during incidents and give them that freedom to go think out of the box and be creative, I think we can come up with more innovative defenses in these situations. The other thing I wanted to say was this may be an interesting use case for the many, many, many threat intelligence services that are now hawking themselves out there. Knowing when a widespread attack against an infrastructure item or a commonly deployed item is going on is definitely helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something that I think is important too, that you've got visibility into, okay, I've got WordPress and I happen to be running this plugin, which just got, popped as vulnerable. There's a patch out there. How often is this being attacked? Right. That's something I want to know.
Yeah, I think just to carry on that thought, I think one of the other bits of value potentially, and I'm definitely still not a big fan of threat intelligence, but I'll.
Yeah, me either. I was trying to be generous, right?
But there's a relatively limited, especially if the attack is as automated as we think in this particular case it was. They're probably dropping a relatively small one of a relatively small number of things on the system. So if your threat intelligence provider is able to give you some kinds of indicators of compromise to look for in the wake of that, hey, that is something that can help you out too. But again, we all know that's not a definitive solution.
Yeah.
So.
And threat intelligence means so many different things, right? A lot of people,
Yep.
hey, here's a bunch of IP addresses that did bad stuff. Well, that doesn't really help me, right?
So it's a blacklist, right?
Right. What? In this particular case, I'm using threat intelligence in a very vague, large, 10,000-foot term to mean what the hell is going on in the industry right now.
Absolutely. Yep. I think the other. One of the other things I was thinking of, and this isn't going to be applicable to probably even most companies, but I still love the idea of what Netflix does with its Chaos Monkey, and and I just wonder if there's some option or some ability to wrap that concept into rapid incident response kind of a process. So anyhow.
No, I agree with you. I think about that a lot, and I think it very much applies. Anytime that we're dealing with any of these things, being able to take a system offline and having some sort of DR capability or business continuity, of course, they're often running the exact same system. So there's definitely something there, right? There's a tweak on the concept of Chaos Monkey that I think can definitely apply to security, but I haven't quite gotten my brain around it fully enough. But I really do love that concept.
Well, I guess one thing is to in the case of a web server, for sure, if you're running Drupal, if you have all that virtualized, conceivably it's ephemeral. You patch you patch a clone, you bring it live, you destroy the production one, and now you're back up and running. You have a known good image, and bing, bang, boom, there you go. I just think there's some, especially nowadays with a lot of the, the cloud virtualization, cloning, whatnot, there's a lot of options, maybe not in every particular use case, but I think there's a lot of new options available to people if they're willing to be creative. So anyhow.
And for those who don't know about Chaos Monkey, certainly you can Google it, but the concept, and I might butcher this a bit, is it's code that randomly kills processes and kills virtual machines within the Amazon Web Services group that basically Netflix uses. So the concept is to build resilient architecture that is self-healing and self-surviving, knowing that at any moment, any one piece of architecture could be basically, in essence, turned off.
Yep. It really changes the way I think you develop systems when you know that something is going to be killing it or messing with it in some way. So anyhow, moving on to our next story. This is another follow-up. It comes from bankinfosecurity.com. The title is Home Depot Breach Cost Credit Union $60 million, with 7.2 million credit union cards affected. So we've talked quite a lot lately about, what is the real impact to these mega breaches? And, one of the points that came up, I think, on the last show is there, relative to the number of cards that are being stolen, there isn't a lot of fraud being carried out. Because the anti-fraud systems in the banks and card brands are pretty good. But one of the things I think that gets sometimes overlooked is the expenses that these banks have to bear, right? So in the case of these credit unions, they've had to reissue 7.2 million cards at a cost of about $8 a card, and they claim that this group of, I think, 835 credit unions that were polled by the CUNA said that they spent a total of $60 million responding to this breach. And that's kind of an interesting business relationship because, in this particular case, the banks and Home Depot have no relationship at all. And so, something that Home Depot did or did not do is able to cause $60 million in is effectively in damages to these banks or these credit unions. And I find that really a very interesting thing. So I suspect, given the number of number of these mega breaches that are happening, that this situation probably isn't going to perpetuate for much longer. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I got to imagine that the banks are really hiring some lobbyists these days.
Yeah, this lacks some context, right? I would be very curious of the 60 million. How does that compare to the average annual fraud rate and fraud costs these guys are dealing with? Is this a blip on the radar? Is this a massive speed bump? Is this existential in the cost? How much is this truly to this group of organizations is one thing I'd be curious about. At the end of the day, they know that there's going to be a level of fraud and a level of shrink associated with the type of credit card system that we use today. They're willing to accept that because of the convenience for the users. That's the trade-off between the security and the convenience. So when do we get to that point where that shrink level has now risen to a point where they feel that moving to a less convenient system potentially and the costs involved in the friction of using that is worth it?
I think that is one of the really important questions. But I would say I think the other reality, although I think they're moving away from it, is that there's a disconnect between the number of cards that are stolen and the number that are that have fraudulent charges. And I think what we have is a situation like I would almost guarantee you that the 7.2 million cards that they apparently replaced didn't all have fraudulent charges on them.
Oh, certainly. We know that. We know that for a fact.
And so I guess my point is that it's kind of asymmetric because they're having to replace cards that don't have fraud charges against them. So it's not like the normal and I guess I don't have some context here, so I'm speaking out of turn. But I would imagine that in a normal year, without all of these large retailer breaches, a lot of the card fraud comes from skimmers and things like that, where the card is objectively stolen and used, and there aren't just stacks and stacks of cards being stolen that have to all be replaced at the same time, like it's happening now. So I think to me, it seems like it's probably a different situation. But again, I don't know. I would imagine, $60 million is probably a lot of money for a credit union.
Well, it's a group of credit unions.
Yeah, a group of credit unions, sure.
Right. So we don't know if that's spread out over 20, 50, 80, 500, 1,000, 5,000.
But by the way, that amount is twice what it cost them for Target.
Yeah, that is interesting. I was curious about that. Somewhat adjacent to the story is later in the article, the Retail Federation starts getting real snarky. They start sort of lobbing some grenades at each other. The credit union associations and the retail associations start really pointing fingers. So that's going to get interesting.
Yeah, the retailers retail associations are basically saying, "Hey, how come we have all of these, these other groups, that are willing to work with us, like banks and and other retailers, but you credit unions won't come to the party with us." So, and on the other hand, the credit unions are saying, you guys are killing us. You're killing our business. You're not operating in a secure manner, and it's causing us boatloads of money. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
So moving on to our next and final story. This one also comes from bankinfosecurity.com, and the title is "Phishing Attack Leads to Title Firm Breach."
I am shocked.
I know.
Here.
I know. So this this sounds very similar to a story we talked about last week, where I think it was a physician, if I'm not mistaken, who had his email account breached. And in that case, there was some PHI stolen. In this case, apparently a number of Fidelity National Financial's employees were phished, and their email credentials to their third-party hosted email system were compromised. And at first I shook my fist in the air and I said, why do these people have bank account numbers and social security numbers and credit card numbers and driver's license numbers in their email? But then I realized, this is their mortgage processor. And, I know when I've bought a house several times now and sold houses several times now, and you're always scanning crap and sending emails to the mortgage company. So that's, I guess, not surprising.
But before you get off that point, there are secure ways to send it, but it's a pain in the ass, and it would confuse non-technical people. So
Absolutely.
Once again, it's a risk that's accepted for the convenience to do business.
Yeah, and it's interesting though that it's the company is accepting that risk on behalf of their customers. So,
And the customers are not demanding a secure transfer method.
That's true. That's very
Right?
true.
So at some point, who's at fault there?
Yep.
Right? I mean, do we all have to be protected from ourselves by the government?
Oh, your libertarianism is showing.
Well, we are on webcam,
Yep.
and I'm not wearing any pants.
I know. I'm trying not to look. So anyhow, this is I guess the parable here is think about how and where your confidential information is sitting in your environment and what kinds of things you do or don't do to protect it. And, in this case, it's kind of interesting. After, in the wake of this breach, when their chief compliance officer, who wrote the letter to the unnamed number of impacted customers, basically said, we're taking steps to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I think if you read between the lines, that probably means they're turning on two-factor authentication to their Gmail hosted account or Office 365 hosted account. So I guess there's that.
Which is great, except then it breaks everybody's mobile access.
Yep. Well,
And then executives will whine.
I don't know what to tell them at that point.
I'm just saying, I'm just kind of beating on that drum of convenience versus security.
Yeah. Well, I think don't they? I think I know at least in Google. I'm not sure about Office 365. I think Google lets you set up an OAuth token. So when you set up your phone, if you have two-factor, you're basically authenticating with an OAuth token.
Yeah, you've got a couple options too. You can actually also set up specific, unique one-time passwords. Not one time. That's not true. Unique password per device.
Right. Yep.
That's static, which is kind of a hybrid approach. But again, you've got to, help the salespeople, execs, and non-technical people through that setup process. And it may be the right thing to do, but it's something that I think a lot of folks would go, it's too much pain. I just want my iPad to work. And right, we circle back around to this problem. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm saying that these are the decisions companies are making every day. And sometimes they're the right decision for whatever it is they need to do. So it's not just about, don't do this, it's stupid. It's about understanding you're accepting this risk.
Yep.
And then, is there a way to still allow this service demanded by the users and still monitor for fraudulent activity without making it too inconvenient, in a passive manner in some way?
Right. Right. And Fidelity National Financial would definitely like their customers to know that even though their record, all their information was completely owned, that the attackers did not penetrate the company's network. So I guess there's that.
Yay, cloud!
And then the other thing is, what did they offer their impacted customers? What would that be?
Credit monitoring?
Oh my gosh, yes, credit monitoring.
I now have 87 different credit monitoring services going.
Although I will say in this particular case, it's probably more useful than in many of the other kinds of cases because, they're apparently they got your social security number, your address, your name, your driver's license number.
And this is something I harped on a long, long time ago, and a listener was kind enough to educate me on. I used to say it would be nice if we could change our social security number when it's been compromised, but I was under the impression there was no way to do that. However, you can indeed file and apply for a replacement social security number, but it is a massive pain in the ass. So not viable for most folks. So I go back to, now I say, an easy way to update your social security number.
Over the web. Point and click, that'd be cool.
Via Telnet, I think. There should be a Telnet service.
Yes.
You just Telnet in.
Yes. That's right.
You have to play a game of Zork to get to the right
They
room.
could just add that functionality to healthcare.gov, don't you think? Oh boy. Yep, I went there. So yeah, that was that story. Again, I think it's one of those deals where it's easy to armchair quarterback.
Yeah.
Their decision to not use two-factor. I think that depending on the service that you're using, it's probably more difficult or easier to implement on different devices. I'd say look around and see what's available to you. It's becoming, one of the things that when I read this story, one of the long time ago, I worked for a COO, and he was a vehement opponent to letting people keep email. He was pretty draconian. I was running IT for the company at the time, and it was like 1,000 people, and he wanted to, basically impose pretty draconian retention restrictions. It's like 30 days and your email is gone. It's just a very draconian view on things. And his point was, it's when you have that email hanging around, it's a liability. It's a liability from the perspective that, and his view was more from a legal discovery perspective. But I think obviously there's no context about what was hanging out in these people's inboxes, but if it's anything like most people, it was probably every email they've ever gotten. And if you hang on to it, it is, it's a liability. It's a potential liability. So you need to, I would encourage people to think about email and other things in the context of data retention requirements. And do you really want that stuff hanging out, into perpetuity, kind of sitting around waiting to be potentially stolen? So that's, I guess my parting thought for the day.
Indeed. I feel like, we don't have a lot of energy on this show, so I apologize if anyone's like, wow, these guys seem down. Jerry's on some good painkiller meds. I'm just feeling rough today, I guess. But we'll be back. We'll bounce back.
That's right.
We'll be pumped.
It's a new week next week. And maybe I'll have maybe my hand will not be hurting so much. Anyhow, as we mentioned at the beginning, we really appreciate everyone's time listening to the podcast. If you have any thoughts or feedback, send us an email to info@defensivesecurity.org. You can find links to all the stories we talk about on this episode and all the back episodes on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kellett on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And
for the record, right now Jerry has more followers than I do, so I think we should try to fix that.
Yes. And by fix that, he means I should have many more.
Hey, no. Yeah. I post about interesting aviation stuff.
I will
space stuff.
I post funnier stuff.
And occasionally InfoSec stuff.
Yeah. Anyhow,
cat pictures.
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
All right. Catch y'all later. Take care.
Watch out for that cyber diabetes.
And cyber Ebola. Bye. You hitting that stage in life finally, huh?
I am. I'm like Bobby Brady. I'm going through changes. I was going to say something meaningful and I lost it. I'm sorry.